Hello, and welcome to Tangled Twists. I'm Lissa, and today we will be completing our Viking Modern wardrobe by making a wool overtunic. One of the things that I love about the Viking Modern look is the ability to put on lots and lots of layers. It's very versatile in that way, and that's part of what makes it such a great winter wardrobe option. The more you can put on, the warmer you're going to be. The topmost layer of the general outfit that I like to use is a short-sleeved wool tunic. I do short sleeves so you can still see the tunic that goes underneath the long sleeve shirt that goes under. You could make this long sleeve, and honestly, I probably should make a few that are, because cold is bad. I do not like cold, and the more of your body that's covered, the warmer you stay. So today we will be using the same drafting techniques that we used on the long sleeve tunic to make an over tunic to add that extra layer. These two processes are very, very similar. The biggest difference is that we're going to be adding a little bit more ease to the overgarment, and that's to give it space to go over the clothes. Since you're already wearing something, you don't want it to be exactly the same size as the piece you already have on. That starts to get a little uncomfortable, so we're going to build in a little bit of extra space for that. You'll use the measurements you took for the long sleeve tunic, but we need to change the sleeve. We're only going to the elbow here, so place the end of the tape at your shoulder and pull it somewhat taut through your other hand. Use your chin to hold the shoulder end in place and mark where your elbow crease is. All right, this is the list of measurements that we worked with to make our under tunic. And to make life easy, this is what we're going to work with to do the over tunic that we're working on. I like to make my over tunics have shorter sleeves so that more of the color underneath shows, and that's why we took a new arm measurement. And for me, I will be using 10 inches there. That's about half the length. And so what that's going to do functionally is cut the sleeve off about there. So all of this will be visible on the green sleeve, and all of this will be visible as the blue sleeve. Everything else is going to stay about the same. One thing that you can do here is add 1 inch to your pieces. So instead of having your chest be 24, you could take it up to 25. I normally do that, and I didn't in this case because the fabric widths that I was working with, I'll show you that here in just a second. But the reason to do that is you don't necessarily want your clothes being exactly the same size when you're stacking them on top of each other, and adding 1 inch is an easy way to give a little bit of space in between. So you would add that inch to the bust, you would add that inch to the body, and you can add that inch to the bicep in the sleeve. It's not, strictly speaking, necessary for the sleeves. It's mostly across the body where you don't want things binding. And then you do the same thing where you figure out your layout. And I've done that here. I'm using the same width of fabric, and that's part of the reason why I left this measurement at 24. The other reason is that this wool that I'm using is a little bit stretchy, and so it's going to hold everything pretty comfortably, I think. I did add to the length because I thought I might want that to be a little bit longer. So I have 31 inches for my length. This will be the shoulder seam. I have set the layout out for this a little bit differently because my sleeves are shorter. It's more efficient to use my fabric if I make one cut that comes across here and then start slicing into that to make the other pieces. Since the sleeves are smaller, I'm not trying to cram in extra pieces. I think on my layout for the other one, what I wound up doing was the full body sleeve and sleeve. You can see because the sleeves are longer, they take up a lot more space. This was the more efficient way to go. That changes here because the sleeves are smaller. And that's exactly the order that I'm going to cut them in. So I'm going to make my first cut across here. So these two gussets are going to have to shift over a little bit. And this is to make everything easy and straight so I don't have to fuss around. So I'll cut that piece off from the bulk of my fabric, and then I'll cut this piece off and this piece off. Then I'll separate the sleeves, and then I'll come back and cut those two gussets out of a little corner of that main body of fabric. We're returning to my kitchen floor for more fabric cutting. This time we're doing it differently. Since I can't pull threads on my wool, I'm going to be using my rotary cutter. I've chosen to use the rotary cutter instead of marking and cutting lines because it will move the fabric less. I do struggle with rotary cutters though, so I am taking some precautions. After making sure my fabric edges are lined up with the marks on my cutting mat as best it can be, I'm using multiple rulers to make sure I'll be cutting in a straight line. My long ruler is metal and is excellent for cutting against. My clear ruler gives me extra points to line up with the cutting mat. By using the clear ruler to brace the long ruler, I know I'm going to be as close to perfectly straight as possible. I find that rulers like to wiggle when you cut against them, so I always put as much of my weight on the ruler as I can to prevent them from moving. I also always cut on the right side. It seems to work better for me. My first cut is to get the fabric I need and make it more manageable to work with. Once I have a smaller piece, it becomes much easier to line up the fabric and the rulers with the cutting mat. That narrow length of wool you see is the only waste I'm getting from cutting. I did still need my underarm gussets, so I cut those out of a small corner of the big piece of fabric. The big piece is still perfectly usable. Just like with the long sleeve tunic, we're going to start on the sleeves. Mark one point of the gusset from the seam allowance on each side. This is the point that you'll use for sewing. Line the gusset up with the sleeve and sew from the marked point to the edge. Pull up the other side of the sleeve, keeping right sides together, pin and repeat the sewing on the other side from that marked point. Next, you'll complete the arm seam. Pin the underarm opening closed and sew from the gusset stitching to the sleeve cuff. Now I need to seam my body pieces since I cut them separately. If yours came out as a solid piece, you can skip ahead to placing the sleeves. I've remembered to switch to my walking foot here to make sure that my fabric is feeding correctly. Heavier fabrics don't always move under the foot at the same rate between the top and bottom pieces, and the walking foot makes sure they move together so you don't end up with uneven ends. Fold the sleeve in half and mark the top edge. Match the mark with the top seam on the body. Pin your sleeve in place. When you go to sew, repeat what we did with the gusset. Mark your corner point and sew from that point all the way around the seam and stop at the point. Be sure not to sew past your mark. It will make the gusset pucker. Then we're on to finishing up the body. We're doing this just like we did the sleeves. Line up the body sides and pin them in place. Mark about halfway down. We're not going to the very end of the hem. Sew from the gusset stitching to your mark. You may have noticed that, unlike the shirt we made, this tunic hasn't been pressed in between steps. Since I'm working with wool that doesn't fray, I'm not nearly as worried about keeping the edges neat. Had this been linen, I would have been seam finishing at every step. I do need the allowances here to be nice and flat though, so I am pressing now. You're probably seeing steam and wondering why I'm using steam and full heat on wool. I have a firm policy of not making clothes that I can't easily clean. I pre-wash all my fabrics, wool and silk included, with hot water and hot dry. I like to be able to wash what I make, so I treat every fabric as harshly as possible before I use it. It gets the vast majority of the shrink out and means that I can wash my woolens and not have to remember to take them to the cleaners. It also means I can press without extra shrinkage. Here I'm only pressing the seams flat. I'm not folding them under because they won't fray. The allowances will be held in place with decorative stitching. The tunic is already nearly done, so now we get to do the fun part. It's time to embellish. I have a small collection of wool thread that I use when I'm working on wool, but you could just as easily use embroidery floss. I'm using an embroidery stitch that makes a chevron pattern to secure the seam allowance and add some decorative flair to the tunic. The most exciting part for me was putting on the trim. This is trim that I wove myself using tablet weaving. I've never put tablet woven trim on anything before, much less trim I made, so I am really happy to be able to do this. The tablet weaving is pretty tight, but I was still careful not to give the ends a chance to fray. I enclosed them in the folded allowance on the tunic hem and folded them under on the sleeve cuffs. I've left spaces to either side of the trim on purpose. I'm thinking I might want to do more embroidery on it, but I haven't come across anything that seems right, so I'm leaving space to add embroidery in the future. The trim is applied with a whip stitch using a dark thread. The thread hides in the weaving and blends in with the wool so you don't see it. I'm carrying the yellow chevron along all the major seams. I also continued along the side slits, which turned out a lot neater than I was expecting. I had to do the small chevrons after the trim was added so that it would mesh well with enclosing the trim edges. Now that most of the fiddly parts are done, I can cut the neck opening. I've folded the body flat around the shoulder seam so that I can mark all of this at once. I'm lining the template line up with the shoulder seam, and that puts 2/3 of the opening on the front of the tunic. This is what decides which side is front and which side is back. I'm also checking to make sure that the vertical line is lined up with center front. I mark around the template with chalk and very carefully cut the circle free. It's easy to make a mistake and cut fabric that you don't want to here, so be very, very careful. I usually start with a very small slit and go from there. It turned out that I had just enough trim left that I could embellish the neck edge as well. This tunic is going full fancy. The trim is pretty hefty and doesn't curve very well, so I did need to alter the neckline. Once I pinned the trim into place, I could cut the remaining V section of fabric free along the top edge of the trim. I had thought that stitching the trim on with yellow wool would look nice, but I pretty quickly decided that it didn't. I ended up picking that out, and instead I stitched the trim on with a dark thread as I did with the other trim sections. I may use decorative stitching to apply trim in the future, but I will need to consider the color and stitch patterns when I'm planning that if I want it to actually look nice. I wasn't too keen on the flat trim edge at the bottom of the neck, so I hunted around online and I found a little embroidery medallion that would finish out the V really nicely. The wool was grabbier than I expected, which means the embroidery started to pucker. I had to redo the stitching here by picking everything I had done out and doing it again. That's something to pay attention to when you're embroidering without a hoop or stabilization. Let's just start with the tunic first off. I am really pleased with how it turned out. I've never used my own trim on a garment before, so that was really fun and a bit of a learning experience. The trim was a little bit bulkier than I would maybe prefer for something like this, but I'm also used to using modern trims, which tend to be a lot thinner. So instead of the piece being wide or narrow, I'm talking about the actual thickness of the piece. So a modern ribbon is very, very thin. The tablet woven band that I used has probably maybe 3 millimeters of thickness to it. That's quite a lot. So it is a little bit bulky. I love it anyway, and I love how the colors turned out. I also played with the embroidery at the base of the neck for the first time. I didn't quite have enough of the band to go all the way or even make like a little point at the bottom of the neck. So I filled that in with that embroidery, and I love how that looks. I've had a lot of fun decorating this top. It's much more embellished than I would usually make. Normally I go plain and simple, but I really quite like how this turned out. It's a really chic, lovely look it's just gorgeous, and I am so happy to have a piece that looks that nice. Then let's talk about throwing it all together. This turned out so well. The colors turned out brilliantly together. Everything coordinates really well. It's a very functional look. It's a very comfortable look. The blue wool that I used to make this tunic was fantastic. It's a little bit stretchy, which most of the wools that I typically use are not, but the color is just so rich. I do have a little bit more of this. I think when I bought it initially, I was going to use it for some skirts. It's so pretty, and in wearing this tunic, I want nothing more than to make a lovely, like medieval style fitted dress or gown out of that fabric. So I'm gonna have to see how much of it I still have and what I might be able to squeeze from it. I think it could make a really nice long sleeve look as well, because it is a little bit stretchy. I think it'll go over other fabrics quite nicely without quite as much bulk, so it may be a really good in-between layer. So if I wore a long sleeve shirt, a long sleeve tunic, and then put a short sleeve tunic over that for additional layers, additional warmth. I've told you, I don't like cold. I will wear as much wool as it is possible to put on my body if it keeps me warm. So All in all, this look has been absolutely fantastic. It's been a delight to make. I'm really looking forward to making more of my own trims and doing more embellishments to make my stuff a little bit more interesting and a little bit more fancy. It's super comfortable. I love it to pieces. And that's it for the Viking Modern look for now. I'm sure I will continue to add additional videos to this collection. There's a lot more things that I can make to add to it, so be looking for that in the future. But that's it for just the immediate future. So come on back in 2 weeks on Friday and see what else I have in store for you. I'll see you then.